My name is Maxine Molyneux. I am Professor of Sociology at the Institute of the Americas, University College London. Welcome to my exp. Well, the first thing to say is that feminism emerges in the whole aftermath and period of the Enlightenment as a movement, a radical movement for equality, rights, and justice. And you find, for example, in the 18th century, there are debates about rights. We have the American Revolution, we have the French Revolution, we have Declaration of the Rights of Man, and we have debates about emancipation of slaves and the emancipation of women. So the 18th century is the kind of beginning of discussion about women's place in society, and women are beginning to demand their own rights. And indeed, when the Declaration of the Rights of Man was issued during the French Revolution, Olympe de Gouges produced the rights of women. And for her pains, alas, because she was a monarchist, she ended up in the guillotine. However, the issue of women's rights was taken up and continued to be a major concern throughout the 19th century in particular, when you see the very first feminist movements beginning to gather together and to put together sets of demands for equality, to be recognized as full human beings with full rights, and to end the symbolic and legal injustices that women were subject to. So the period of the 19th century is, if you like, the inception of feminism. And you do indeed see those very first women's movements beginning to make demands for suffrage, for the right to have an education, the right to enter the professions. And in the 20th century, it is that movement that takes off as the first wave of feminism. In the 70s, feminists began to question the whole cultural setup in their societies and to demand cultural change as well as structural change. And so there were periods of engagement with changing laws, again, a strong theme, demanding rights and multiplying the kinds of rights. So you have added to rights for equality, for a right to education, changes in the law. You have demands for to be given protection against violence, changes in the law that would bring tougher sentencing to those who were perpetrators of violence against women. Again, these were themes that also were able to be developed over the next 40 years, and of course are very important in the women's movements today. You have at the entry of many feminist women into organizations, into governments, into changing laws. And some feminists call this sort of a period of institutionalization, where you have more activity to really bring about specifically legal change and to advance a program of women's rights in the fullest form. And the culmination of this was the four conferences that the UN held in order to kind of push forward on human rights programs. And the women's movement was very active in those conferences, but also during the UN Decade for Women. And what we see coming out of activism, not just in the West, but across the world, is a series of meetings in which women from all over the world would meet and would try to develop and push forward a program of women's rights. And this culminated in the most radical of bodies of law, which was the Convention for the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, CEDAW as it's called for short, which was ratified in 1979 and came into force in 1980. You do see an explosion from 2010 onwards of youth movements, protest movements across the world. And very important part of those movements were young women joining in those movements, but also developing their own forms of organization and their own demands. And you get a new vitality brought into feminism by a new generation of young women activists who take to the streets in huge numbers around issues of violence against women, around issues of reproductive rights, and have enormous success in organizing these protests and in pushing forward a platform of demands, in many cases radical demands that extend the kind of feminist purview to include LGBT struggles, Black struggles, and a whole range of other struggles, including, of course, and very importantly, environmental issues, which in effect previous generations had done relatively little to advance in terms of any programmatic change. And it's very striking that we see, for example, a very young feminist in the case of Greta Thunberg, the Swedish 16-year-old who became symbolic, if you like, of a new form of young women taking a very active role in international politics.